Welcome to the Restitutor Orbis channel, and today we're going to be returning to St. Louis, Rome of the West for an on-site exploration. And you're probably asking, why are we returning to St. Louis? And one of the individuals I'd spoken to on the ground in St. Louis informed me that it was called Rome of the West. And I asked why. And this person told me, well, it's because of the Catholic diocese and all the Catholic individuals who resided in St. Louis. But I suspected there may be another reason, and we're going to explore that today. Our exploration is going to take us to the Grand Avenue Water Tower and the Bissell Street Water Tower. We're going to be examining them close and in person to see how large they actually are. We're also going to be looking at Eads Bridge and examining that, along with the old Courthouse in downtown St. Louis. Then there's several locations in the downtown that we're going to be taking a look at, along with Union Station and the Court Appeals, or the U.S. Appeals Court that we looked at in the previous exploration. What I suspect is that a lot of the architecture in St. Louis resembles what we would think of as Greco-Roman architecture. Now, we come across this in old world explorations before, but we're really going to be examining this to see if this is the real reason why St. Louis is called Rome of the West. As I suspect that was merely a statement story, if you will, about the vast number of Catholics in St. Louis. We'll always be told something along those lines, that there's some other explanation for it. When we look at the downtown, though, we see the U.S. Appeals Court building and several other beautiful Art Deco buildings. We also have the St. Louis City Hall that we're going to be examining, and Stifel Theater right along there, and there's Union Station. So when we look at these locations, we're going to be examining them in person and up close to see exactly how large they truly are and what sort of construction they have. We'll be moving over to Compton Hill, where we'll look at the other standing stovepipe water tower, or standpipe water tower, and there's also some very interesting houses located along the street in the Compton Hill area. And I want to make sure that we examine some of the residential areas as well, because some people say that, well, if you just have one isolated building, it doesn't necessarily prove or indicate anything. And that may be true. But when you have several residences around a certain particular area that appear like old world buildings, or let's just say you have an entire neighborhood of old world buildings, that may tell a slightly different story. And we'll be concluding the exploration by going back and taking a look at the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis, moving north and west from the Compton Hill area, and concluding with the Cathedral Basilica. Something that I must admit, I was quite surprised with how tremendously large this location truly was. So when we look at all these different edifices, we're going to consider exactly the construction techniques, and we're also going to consider what kind of thought process went into their building if we go off of the mainstream account. And recall that the mainstream account of the city of St. Louis was that it was founded years past, and yet when we look at images in several of the earlier bird's eye views, we see that it's very well built out. And what I learned being on the ground is that it is still well built out. One of the aspects that you learn with St. Louis is how far to the west it actually goes from the river. And we have another story of a fire in St. Louis in 1849 that was started by a ship that rammed into another ship, and then somehow the buildings caught fire. And I've been assured by some very, we'll just call them emphatic individuals in the comments, that this fire really did happen. I'm not sure how they could be so certain about it. I mean, we have pictures of essentially every city in the United States that show fire damage and destruction. And of course, we recall that St. Louis being referred to as the City of the Mounds, and someone else also took issue with that. But who knows exactly where these mounds really were? There's very little left of them. We also have our traditional images of St. Louis, looking at it from the 1890s through the early 20th century, and we have many questions in the images that we see. We're also told that it was struck by a tornado in the 1890s, so you have a fire, a tornado, the usual slew of disasters, whether they were artificial or natural. That gives you a lot of explanation. One thing we didn't look at, though, in this exploration is the Wainwright Building. It's not that the Wainwright Building's not particularly interesting, but what I wanted to focus on for this one is looking at all the Greco-Roman architecture. Now, I didn't limit it to that, but I didn't get to the Wainwright Building. So let's begin with the Grand Avenue Water Tower, the tallest freestanding Corinthian column in the world, over 150 feet. And strangely enough, it's also within sight of the Bissell Street Water Tower. I find this very interesting because we're told that this beautiful water tower was built in 1871. Why did they need to build another one so close to it? And when you look at it in person, you're just completely taken aback by how large it really is and how tall it is. Imagine if this was an actual column that supported some large structure. And maybe that's originally what the Bissell Street Water Tower, which you can see in the background there, was a part of as well. Just an amazing large column. And yet in that same area, there was also an abandoned church that didn't appear to be any sort of a lacking building in any way, shape, or form. We can see we have the large window and very beautiful architecture and construction on this with the columns and the pillars. Yet this church is completely abandoned. And look at how beautiful it is. This neighborhood is very interesting because it appears to be suffering from neglect, and yet you have all these very beautiful buildings. One thing you'll notice as we go on with this exploration in St. Louis is that everything is either made of masonry or stone. And it'll be one of the questions that I have for you at the end of the video because I'd like to get some feedback. There's also just these other buildings that are in the immediate area. Here we have the Good Hope Baptist Church, and we have some nice beautiful columns on the front, and all made of brick. And here's the original church that we were looking at that was abandoned. It has this beautiful tower. And it has these wonderful figures on it, and you can see that no effort was spared in this architecture. And yet this is abandoned, this is neglected. Well, now we move on to the Bissell Street Water Tower, and this one was built in 1886 or so we're told. And this is more incredible construction. As if the tallest freestanding Corinthian column in the world wasn't enough, you walk 2 blocks over where for some reason they needed another water tower, and they built this beauty. And then you look at the houses in the residential area, and you see that they're all constructed out of brick themselves, and are all old world structures. So it's not just the water towers, it's an entire neighborhood made of brick and masonry. So make of that what you will. The foundation stones or blocks are just incredible. And it looks to be a combination of granite and limestone and some sort of very solid concrete. And I'm certainly not going to suggest that it's Portland cement. I have a feeling Portland cement would not hold up too well under these conditions, if we consider the fact that this tower is as old as they say it is. 1886 to 2023. And it's holding up this well, and it is this beautiful. And it's quite an awe-inspiring sight. And many of the things that we're going to be taking a look at in this exploration are awe-inspiring. Such as the Eads Bridge, built from 1867 to 1874. Yes, that fine building time after the United States Civil War. And pointing out some of the blocks here, as someone told me, this is merely an architectural process called rustication. Yes, there's always some architectural process to explain why the blocks protrude or why they age the way they did, because in one of the original images of the Eads Bridge, it already looked old. Well, of course, it still looks old now, but it's closing on 150 years old. Look at some of the archways, though, and then it's mixed with the bricks there. What I find most amazing, though, is that this bridge is still standing and has had limited renovation work on it for over 149 years. And why do we have different coloring there? Is that from some subsequent fire, or is that just some other architectural process that causes selective aging on some of these blocks, or maybe they look a little older? That's the Eads Bridge, and it's a very awe-inspiring sight, and the fact that it's still standing and still functional to this day, with vehicles, trains, and pedestrian traffic going over it, yes, that's not questionable at all. I have a question, though. Could we build a bridge today that would last 150 years, and that would be doing this well with our modern construction processes? Maybe we could, but I still find it very impressive that at that time we could build a bridge. And then look at this, all these beautiful buildings in the downtown of St. Louis with different construction techniques from bottom to top with the base stones. And finally we reach the old courthouse, one that was built in the 1820s and then added to, the one that appears quite a bit like a state capitol. Unfortunately, I couldn't access the inside of it because once again they were doing renovations, so make of it what you will. But I was able to get some great exterior footage of it, and you can see what a beautiful building it is with the pediments and the columns, and of course the beautiful dome. This seemed to be something that was a little advanced for its time because, as you recall, looking at dome architectural prints in the United States from the early 19th century, they had a different style, such as what we saw at the U.S. Capitol. And yet, this completely defies that. This defies that timeline. And even close to the courthouse, you'll find other buildings of beautiful architectural style, such as this particular building, which was only a block away, and you see the large columns and the interesting sphere at the top of it. And I verified that this is all real material, all hard masonry construction. Mississippi Valley Trust Company with the beautiful pillars incorporated in the wall. Very intriguing. Now, continuing down the road from the old courthouse, you see the U.S. Appeals Court. That was the building that was very easily constructed in the late 1920s, where we had that fun picture of the individual who was just hanging on by a foot as they were lifting one of the columns in place. Yes, I'm sure it was very easy to build that. And it also has what appears to be the mausoleum of Helicanarsis on the top with the two sphinx-like figures, which just happen to sit in between the arch. And no, I didn't look at the arch. I really wasn't feeling like looking at more modern architecture today. It was a rather hot day, and I figured the best way to spend it was to look at these old world structures. And finally we reached the Union Station. And the Union Station is one of the buildings that I recall looking at in a joint exploration with Old World Exploration, and that was quite enjoyable. And looking at it in person is no less awe-inspiring. Built in the 1890s with these very large blocks and this very beautiful architecture. And look at this large tower with the clock. It's quite awe-inspiring, though, to see it in person and to realize that this building is real and you can interface with it. From my perspective, it was not a picture, it was not a video. I could see it, I could walk up to it, and walk inside of it. And don't worry, we've got some footage from the inside of the Union Station in St. Louis. Just incredibly beautiful, and my mind kept spinning trying to figure out how exactly they would have moved all these large blocks in place, how they would have arranged them in the 1890s. Yes, it's on the railroad. It makes sense that they could have brought them in on the railroad. But they still would have had to arrange all these blocks and build these beautiful towers. And what was the purpose behind all this for what was just a train station? And yet, when you examine a lot of this block work and this masonry up close and in person, you can see that it's holding up quite well. It looks very beautiful today, and it's probably going to last another 1,000, 10,000, or 100,000 years. I mean, just look at the size of some of these blocks, and here I put out my hand for comparison for just how large this block truly is. So even if you brought it in on a train, how long would it have taken to put all these blocks in place? And it's very impressive the way they fit together. Going inside, though, the first thing you come across is what's called Whispering Arch. So naturally, the entryway has an arch in it, and what you can do is stand on opposite sides of the arch, and you can whisper, and the whisper will travel across the arch to the person standing on the other side, and they can hear exactly what you're saying. And I'd like to thank Derek, the tour guide, door person, who informed me of this little fact as I walked in. And you'll see that inside the Union Station, you're just awed by unbelievable beauty. And you have columns and arches everywhere you look, and this beautiful window and this relief with this imagery in it. And that's the Whispering Arch right there, which seems to reflect some of the cymatics that we've encountered in other explorations. And this building, the Union Station in St. Louis, seems to reflect this capability. But when you look inside of this main gallery, this is just exceptional. These figures that you're looking at are not painted. They're actually relief figures, which I thought was utterly astounding. It's not just the size and immensity of the inside of the Union Station, it's the sheer level of detail and the effort that it had to take to construct all of this. So it's not just the fact that they built what we see as a castle or a chateau or whatever you want to call it, a palace on the outside. It's also all this detailed work that they went on the inside. And I came a little closer to the figures so that you could see that these are actual reliefs, that they protrude from the wall. How difficult was this? We're told that it only took them 3 years to build this incredible building. Oh, and it does have a bathroom, and the bathroom seems to be adorned with gold. So make of that what you will. Finally, a building that was actually designed with a bathroom in mind. And you see this beautiful clock right here with the old-style Roman numerals on it, and yet more arches, more decoration. And I did verify that all these materials were hard masonry. And it's as though you just couldn't get enough columns here in this building. And here's another view of the reliefs. Very beautiful. And what does this symbolize? What does this represent? Wondering on the potential original purpose of this incredible building. And I know many viewers have their own theories, and please share them in the comments because I always enjoy reading them. And here, even verifying that what looks to be tile is some sort of marble, and here you have more of a granite, limestone, sandstone construction, or some other material we have no idea what it truly is. Of course, we'll be told by the experts that they know what it is, but that's something I'm questioning even now. I'm just astounded by how well this building that's over 130 years old, especially the materials, is holding up. And even on the train shelter side of it, if you will, they've modernized it a little bit, and they're still taking good care of it. So that is somewhat pleasing to see, although it looks very different. At least they didn't let it erode or rot away. This is in the hotel section, and they have this lobby set up here with these very beautiful pillars. Now, from my close investigation, these do seem to be painted wood, but even so, it's very beautiful, and they've put a lot of effort into making this grand lobby of this hotel portion of it appear very beautiful and very welcoming. Certainly more so than what you'd get in the Holiday Inn Express, which is what we settle for hotel accommodations and luxury now. And I look at these framed images of the so-called plans of the building, although I'm kind of reminded of one of our earlier explorations when we posited if architects were really architects or were they just recorders. When I see schematics, drawings like this, I'm given the reminder of recorders. It feels as though someone was simply going over this building and going over this site, and they were merely recording what they saw. Could be wrong, but when you look at all the artistic impressions and you verify that this is all the real material, it gives you a completely different inspiration of going through the Grand Hall in Union Station in St. Louis. You realize that somebody put a lot of time and had an incredible amount of capability to construct something like that. When we go back down towards the downtown a little bit, and here we look at the U.S. Appeals Court building, and we see the beautiful columns that were somehow lifted high, apparently somebody nearly slipping to do that. And it's also surrounded by Art Deco buildings, and yet many other buildings. Here the memorial that we have in St. Louis to the World War I veterans. And then I found this interesting building that I just happened to be standing in front of while I was taking that footage. And it appears as though this was some sort of Missouri Court of Appeals building, but it didn't look like it was in use right now. Didn't really look into it because I was more inspired by what I saw on the outside of the building with all the columns, and seeing that this was yet another building that a lot of effort had been put into constructing. And I'm sure if I looked in the history of it, we'll be told that it was constructed in the 1930s. But verifying that all the blocks on it were hard and real. And finally, we come to the gorgeous City Hall in St. Louis, another 1890s wonder. And then, of course, the statue of our city founder. And then this was the court building that I was looking at. And then there's the theater to the right of it. All these buildings reflect the so-called Greco-Roman style, where you have columns and pillars and pediments and all the usual details that we see when we look at these structures. And this is in St. Louis. And now a close-up of the City Hall. And we see the same thing, although it almost looks like it's more of a beautiful style. Very unique style with this particular City Hall. And seeing pictures didn't quite do it justice, because when you look at it, you get the feeling that you're seeing an amalgamation of different building styles and capabilities. And I wonder if there was a different kind of clock that was originally on display there. And just looking at these archways and how they assembled all these stones, and then you see some of the columns and the pillars. This is just a very unique building, and there's something about it that just defies imagination, that you're looking at a building from a different time, or a different time stream, if you will. And you look at these beautiful arches with these very large, shorter columns on the inside on the entryway. Just defies the abilities of words to describe. But then you look at another building and you see yet more columns. And you see more of those construction techniques. And then, of course, looking back at the original U.S. Court of Appeals, and you can see the two sphinxes on top of it, and all the columns that were so easy for them to lift up in place when they built that building. Well, now I moved over to take a look at Stifle Theater, or Stifle Theater as I called it, because the individual in the front was not very accommodating about letting me look around on the inside unless I bought a ticket, which is fine. But I find it interesting that this building, which was supposedly built in the early 1930s, has a couple bears out in front of it. And then they went to the effort of inscribing this on the side of the wall, where they broke up the word government. Democratic government. And look, they say democratic. They don't say constitutional republic. So once again, even in the 1930s, that's what we were selling to the people of the United States. And I have no doubt that we were the ones who inscribed those words in such a sloppy way on the side of that building, or at least the civilization that we're a part of. But yet you see these beautiful bear figures out in front, and verified that they were material. That was real. Oh, here we go. Woodrow Wilson. And here we have more broken up words. Very interesting. Common, consul. Yeah, council, consul. But looking at the beautiful columns and all the materials that went into this, I have great difficulty believing that that was built at the time. Anywhere you drive in St. Louis, you'll see the same thing. Beautiful buildings made out of brick. How many bricks are there total in St. Louis? And then, of course, the foundation stones that you see on nearly every single house. Whether it's a school, an administration building, there is no shortage of what you're looking for. And they called this a library museum, although the front portion of it's standing with a pediment in the columns, but it looks like it's collapsing in the back. Every single house that I looked at, though, was made of brick and foundation stones. And now we move to the Compton Hill Water Tower. The Compton Hill Water Tower, constructed in 1898 in the Compton Hill area of St. Louis. A little different than the first area that we looked at, although we'll see many of the same structures. And looking at this water tower more closely, another one of these so-called standpipe water towers, although you may as well call them stovepipe water tower, because what's the difference? You see the same details in construction, beautiful foundation stones, whether they're granite or what have you. And then looking around in the neighborhood, you see that many of these houses and buildings are constructed in a similar fashion, just nothing but old world buildings everywhere you look. Whether it's a house or a larger building, you see amazing brickwork, elaborate emblems, elaborate motifs along them, and then you look back and you see that this is in the Compton Hill area with the water tower in the background. Also looking at the entryway to this neighborhood, and it looks like we have what appear to be either a couple of griffiths or something else, I'm not sure. And then looking at this building with the reliefs on the front of it, Hutchison Arms, and look at the beautiful patterns in the brickwork on this building. And this is all in the same immediate vicinity. And look at the top. It's as though they just had all the time in the world and they were able to construct not just a water tower, but all these buildings. So I decided to take a look at some of the residential or some of the houses or the residential area of the Compton Hill area. And the houses are incredible in and of themselves. They all have the large base foundation stones and they all have the very elaborate brickwork. And you'll even see that some of the entryways have elaborate decorations on them. Now, this is not just one single millionaire's house, although I did stop by to take a look at what was supposedly the Happy Chef's Mansion, as it was called, and there's a little bit of a history with that, but it's a little bit beyond the scope of this video. Yet it's just another elaborate house in a series of elaborate houses that make up this entire neighborhood. So how exactly do you explain this? Typically we'll be told that, well, somebody had a lot of money and that's how they were able to build one or two of these beautiful houses or castles or whatever you want to call them. And yet here in this Compton Hill area of St. Louis, you see nothing but houses that are constructed in this manner. Beautiful houses that are made of brick and have beautiful foundation stones and have all the details that we've come to expect in old world buildings. And it's as though I just couldn't stop spinning around and looking at it enough to really reinforce the point. But I thought a better way that I could do that, instead of just trying to get closer to this one mansion, would be to simply drive down the road and give you an idea of what it truly looks like from the vehicle. And so I just leaned out the side of the window and I want you to look at every single one of these houses and see that they all have old world architecture in every single one, all with the large foundation stones and all made with brick. Now, how exactly do you explain that so many residences could have been constructed in this way? Was everybody just flowing with money? And by the way, the other neighborhood that we were in with the other water towers, you saw many of the same construction details. Well, look at the nice tower on that house, little fairy tale. And yet you'll see it when you look that some have the large foundation stones, others have elaborate brickwork, beautiful arches. It just goes on and on and on. And it eventually reaches a point where it just starts to get absurd because you can't walk anywhere in this part of St. Louis without running into an old world building. Quite frankly, I thought I could spend the rest of my life walking around this town. And I know someone will tell me in the comments, as they've had on many other videos, well, they just simply had more money. People worked harder. Okay, so everybody had more money. Everybody worked harder. How many bricks are just in all these houses alone? How did they produce all these bricks? And I know other explorers have talked about the fact that it's very difficult to locate the brick manufacturing facilities of the 19th century. You'll find simple concrete pads as the only remnants of it. And yet, as you drive down this entire road that runs all the way back to the Compton Hill Water Tower, that's all you see is old world buildings with bricks, with large foundation stones, and all the details of very elaborate construction that we've recognized in the old world. Quite frankly, it is absurd. And it's absurd to think that if you go with the mainstream account, you just simply believe it. And even driving down back into St. Louis itself, heading to the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis, you'll see that there are other amazing, beautiful buildings everywhere you look, with beautiful patterns on them, beautiful motifs, and wonderful, incredible towers on them, as though there was just simply no shortage of time and materials and capability to go around. And yet, going through the entire city, that's exactly what you see. You see that there is nothing that comes beyond what your expectations are. And here, even just looking at this beautiful church, they jump out at you everywhere. And this is the route from Compton Hill heading to the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis. You happen to see a couple other cathedrals on the way. And once again, just looking in any direction, here we have the Scottish Rite Cathedral, because why not? You see nothing but columns, you see pillars, pediments, large foundation stones, yet more columns, every single building that you see in St. Louis. So I ask you, oh look, a pediment with columns on top of it there, because why not? Why wouldn't you just have so many columns and so many base stones? You just can't stop seeing it in St. Louis, and I was completely overwhelmed at all the detail and all the beauty that I saw. And I started to realize that referring to St. Louis as Rome of the West clearly had more to do with its appearance. Every single building also being unique in a way. It had the same details of construction, and yet you would see other individual aspects. How were they able to do this? Everybody was an artisan, everybody was a craftsman, everybody had the capability to make their own individual unique building. And even the smaller residences, they still have the same details in them. And from my perspective, this is exactly why St. Louis is called Rome of the West, because it looks like Rome of the West. In fact, I could argue that it looks more like Rome than Rome actually does. And closing in on the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis, you see how it just comes out of nowhere, and you're completely taken back by how unbelievably large this Cathedral Basilica is. I'm surprised they didn't call it a Cathedral Basilica Temple Church or add more titles to it, because quite frankly, it warrants it. I had no idea how large this edifice was when I did the initial exploration, but getting on the ground and taking a look at it, you're just completely overwhelmed by how magnificent it is and how gargantuan it is. And I could come up with many other adjectives to describe it, but I'll simply let you see it in the imagery. And yet there's all the little detail in the construction, the small archways, the multiple archways, the little pediments, all the little details in a building that was built from 1907 to 1914, early 20th century. Yet good luck finding any construction photos of this incredible cathedral, basilica, temple. And honestly, I would accept the fact if they just would have told us that it was divine intervention that established this very large building in St. Louis, because it completely baffles simple explanation. And now looking at the front facade, and we see our typical cymatic window with beautiful detail and a very unique pattern in it with multiple arches and very large towers. Now that's just the outside of the Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis. So I thought since I'd come all this way, it was only fitting I'd end the exploration by taking a look at the inside. And look at the beautiful cymatic window with the patterns on the front of it. And what would be the purpose behind that in 1907 and 1914? Here's the main entryway to this incredible building, and you can see that it has all the beauty and detail that we'd come to expect to see in the early exploration that we had of Malta earlier in this week when we looked at some of the gorgeous churches there. And here's one of the side halls in the cathedral, and again you can see the same thing. All this beautiful detail from the floor to the walls to the ceiling. And then going and taking a look at the actual altar and looking up in the domes. It is awe-inspiring. And as always, we have more columns because it's not as though we don't have enough columns that we've seen everywhere else. More columns, more arches, and a very beautiful dome from the inside. Decorated and detailed to match the finest cathedrals of Europe. And this is in the United States in St. Louis. this beautiful Cathedral Basilica of St. Louis, which matches any church in the world, or any religious building, or any building in the world with its beauty. And then I guess they decided to throw a little statue that looks like Laurel and Hardy or Jeeves and Wooster out front. So what do you think? Is St. Louis truly the Rome of the West after looking at this on-site exploration? What do you believe is the reality? Is the historical account still applicable to this city? Or is there some other account that we should be considering? What's the real story behind it? You consider all the beautiful edifices that we looked at, from the old courthouse to the Cathedral Basilica to the water towers, and I leave you with 3 questions. How many columns are there in St. Louis total? How many bricks total are there in St. Louis? Because let me assure you, nearly every single building in the interior St. Louis area and working your way out to the west, the northwest, and the southwest is made entirely of brick. And then how many neoclassical structures are there in St. Louis, or what we call the Greco-Roman buildings? Because, again, I assure you, there are far more than you might initially think. Doing this exploration on the ground was very eye-opening, and it showed me that there was much more to St. Louis than meets the eye. Well, thank you for joining me. Please like, comment, and subscribe.